Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of the Sports Beat with Richard Holdridge, presented by Georgia Alabama Sports Live. This is a special edition of the Sports Beat. It is Thursday. I'm away for training for my job, and so you are going to get a best of show. And this is a very special show, but just a reminder that you are listening to us on Home of Southern Sports. 99.1 FM, The Key, out of Noonan, Georgia. I am so happy to be here. And on this episode, I'm going to talk about basketball in the state of Georgia. It's so underrated. When you think of great basketball states, you think of Kentucky, you think of Indiana, you think of North Carolina. You don't really think of Georgia, and there's been a lot of great basketball players to come out of this state. On this show, I am going to rank my top 5 basketball players for the University of Georgia basketball and my top 5 players for Georgia Tech. And it was really hard to come up with this list. I mean, there's been a lot of great players at both schools. I really wish that Georgia and Georgia Tech would just continue making the NCAA tournament year after year. I think that all the talent in this state needs to stay in this state. I think that Georgia Tech's going to have a great season with their new first-year head coach Damian Stoudemire, the University of Georgia, second-year coach Mike White, and I wish the Yellow Jackets and the Bulldogs the best of luck this season. But let's talk about basketball in Georgia, because we've had Dwight Howard come out of this state. We've had Jabari Smith Jr. Right now, Isaiah Collier is playing at USC. And of course, down in Columbus, where I do this show, Sam Mitchell, considered one of the greatest basketball players to come out of Columbus, to include Mark Upshaw as well. They really paved the way for basketball in Columbus. And when you talk about the other schools in Georgia and some of their greatest players, you got to think of Sam Mitchell when it comes to Mercer. Mercer making the NCAA tournament back in 1985. They recently made it in 2014 and made an incredible upset over the Duke Blue Devils, as that was just an incredible moment for Mercer basketball. When you think of Kennesaw State, which their season tickets have skyrocketed this year after making the NCAA tournament appearance last season for Coach Amir Abdur-Rahim, who's now at University of South Florida, and Antoine Petaway, the former Alabama assistant, is now coaching the Kennesaw State Owls. Georgia State, they've made the NCAA tournament for a couple of times in the past 10 years, and R.J. Hunter, who was drafted by the Boston Celtics, is considered the greatest Georgia State player of all time. Who could forget his father falling out of the chair when he made that big shot against Baylor to upset them in the NCAA tournament? But I'm here to talk about Georgia and Georgia Tech. Georgia made the Final Four back in 1983. Georgia Tech made the Final Four in 90 and made it to the championship game in 2004. I'm going to go ahead and start with Georgia Tech, because when you look at Georgia Tech, coached by legendary head coach Bobby Crimmins, they had an incredible run of making the NCAA tournament just about every year from 1985 all the way to 1996. And it was really Bobby Crimmins that recruited a lot of great players, and Georgia Tech was known as Point Guard U. And so I'm going to throw up this graphic. I have come up with a list. These are my top 5 all-time Georgia Tech players. Now, the criteria was, were they amazing in college, and then what did they do in the NBA? Kind of a little mixture of both, but we're going to throw up that graphic for you. This is my top 5 all-time players in Georgia Tech basketball history. You got to start at the top with the ACC Player of the Year in 1986, Mark Price. I'm telling you, Mark Price, he played at Georgia Tech from 1982 to 1986. He was the all-time leader in three-point percentage and steals and minutes played. Mark Price was one of the greatest Georgia Tech players of all time, and that's why I have him at number 1. And then going into his NBA career, I mean, who could forget? He was a catalyst on that Cleveland Cavaliers team from 1986 to 95. That's where his NBA career took him. And here's the thing. He had a great playoff run in 1988. He averaged over 21 points a game. And just imagine, If Jordan doesn't make that shot over Craig Elo, the Cleveland Cavaliers back in 1988, I mean, Mark Price could have been one of the all-timers. He was a great point guard for the Cleveland Cavaliers, and really his basketball IQ has allowed Mark Price to be a head coach in basketball. All right, moving along, I put Chris Bosh over John Salley, and one of the reasons why was that Chris Bosh, even though he played at Georgia Tech just for one season, he's a Hall of Famer. His NBA career is absolutely astonishing. 11-time All-Star. He played in the NBA from 2003 to 2017. He's a two-time NBA champion. He was an all-star with the Toronto Raptors. And then in 2010, one of the most moments that really made me cringe as a sports fan is when LeBron decided to convince Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh to form the Big Three. A lot of people called them the Heatles. They did win 2 NBA titles. A lot of people thought they should have won more because this could have been the greatest team ever assembled, especially with what they did. And there were times where Chris Bosh was out of the picture when it came to shot selection because all the energy was focused on LeBron and Dwayne Wade. But Chris Bosh was a great player, a great rebounder, a great post player. He could shoot from the outside. And a lot of people tend to forget he did play that one season at Georgia Tech in the 2002-2003 season under Coach Paul Hewitt. That was the year before they made it to the NCAA championship. Imagine if Chris Bosh would have stayed at Georgia Tech for his sophomore year. We could be looking at the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets as NCAA champions of 2004 because I know they would have beat Emeka Okafor and Ben Gordon if they had Chris Bosh on that team because they needed size. They had a very good backcourt with B.J. Elder, Jarrett Jack, Will Bynum. They had a good backcourt, but they needed some size. And man, imagine if Chris Bosh, who is way too talented to come back for his sophomore season at Georgia Tech. Chris Bosh was the overall number 4 pick in 2003, probably one of the greatest draft classes of all time. And let's talk about John Salley. I got him at number 3 on this list. John Salley played with Mark Price from 1982 to 1986. Georgia Tech, they came on the scene in 85 when they made the Elite Eight. Bobby Crimmins had a team that was building championships, and then eventually they would make it to the Final Four in 1990 with Lethal Weapon 3. John Salley was a great Georgia Tech player, but a lot of people remember him as part of the Bad Boys with the Detroit Pistons. John Salley was one of those players. He's a 4-time NBA champion. He had longevity. John Salley played from 86 to 2000. He was part of the Bad Boys team coming off the bench, a great role player in the NBA, an actor. He was in the movie Bad Boys. He was in the movie Eddie. I mean, a lot of people don't associate John Salley with somebody who played in Georgia. His number was retired by the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, and I just want to give John Salley some love because he was a member of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets and one of the all-time greats. It's just that he became so big, especially with the Bad Boys Pistons and being a movie star, that a lot of people tend to forget that he was a Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket. All right, number 4, Dennis Scott, part of the Lethal Weapon 3 team with Brian Oliver and Kenny Anderson. He played at Georgia Tech from 1987 to 1990. He was on the all-rookie team with the Orlando Magic. He played in the NBA from 90 to 2000. He averaged over 12 points a game. Played with those Orlando Magic teams, the team that went to the NBA Finals in 1995 with Shaq and Penny and Nick Anderson. Dennis Scott was a part of that team, and he was a great NBA player. He was an all-rookie first team, and he was a very valuable member of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in 1990, making it to the Final Four, however, losing to UNLV. But they were a number 4 seed. They knocked off Michigan State to get to where they needed to go, made a Final Four run as a number 4 seed, but, lost to an all-time great team. I mean, the 90 UNLV Running Rebels, come on. They were one of the greatest teams of all time. Rounding out the top 5 list, I got Kenny Anderson. Kenny Anderson was a very good NBA player. He played for Georgia Tech from 89 to 91. Georgia Tech was still making Sweet 16 appearances, Elite 8 appearances. They were in the NCAA tournament just about every year with Bobby Crimmins. He made the All-Star team in 1994. A lot of people remember him as, the point guard for the New Jersey Nets. He averaged 12.6 points a game, and he had a great NBA career. Some of the honorable mentions, Travis Best. He was a great point guard for Georgia Tech. He played on some of the teams with Bobby Crimmins, played at Indiana. Stephon Marbury. I know that he's had an NBA career that's very interesting because he liked to shoot a lot, and he was just a great shooting guard as far as not an elite NBA player, but he was a scorer. Stephon Marbury could score. And then finally, Derek Favors, which I saw him back in 2009. He was the 3rd overall pick. A lot of people thought Derek Favors didn't pan out in the NBA, but he was highly recruited by Coach Paul Hewitt, who really led the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Once they got him to the championship and he got that extension, I know he was carrying a legacy from Coach Bobby Crimmins. But Paul Hewitt was a decent coach, and Georgia Tech was formidable. They were making the NCAA tournament. Derek Favors was a highly recruited player. And so that is my list. That is the top 5 players from Georgia Tech. If you have a player that I did not mention on here, just write it in the comments. I do want to mention Jason Collier. I thought about this long and hard. Jason Collier, who unfortunately he was tragically killed. He played for the Atlanta Hawks, but he was also a great Georgia Tech player, and I wanted to just remember him because that was an absolute tragedy, and I remember how sad we were. He played at Georgia Tech. He played for the Atlanta Hawks, and Jason Collier was also a great player as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put up that graphic for the all-time top 5 players at the University of Georgia. Look, Georgia basketball does not get a whole lot of love, but, Mark Fox did get him to 2 NCAA championships. You have what happened with Jim Herrick in 2002. I mean, that was just unbelievable what that happened and very shocking. But the Georgia Bulldogs did make it to the Final Four in 1983 under legendary coach Hugh Durham. And I know that was the year after Dominique Wilkins left for the NBA. But let's start with number 1. I mean, it's a clear-cut, unanimous choice. There is no question the number 1 Georgia basketball player of all time is the human highlight film, Dominique Wilkins. Originally from North Carolina, he got recruited by Coach Durham to play at Georgia. He played for the University of Georgia from 1979 to 1982. He averaged 21.6 points a game. He was originally drafted by the Utah Jazz and then got traded over to the Atlanta Hawks. And when you think of Georgia basketball, when you think of athletes on the Mount Rushmore in Georgia, it's Dominique Wilkins because of his NBA career. He is a Hall of Famer. He played in the NBA, but also he was a Georgia Bulldog. In fact, they did have a SEC storied documentary on Dominique Wilkins. My next player, he was briefly mentioned in the movie Air. This is a very underrated player. A lot of people don't realize how great Vern Fleming was. Vern Fleming is number 2, and here's my reason behind that. Averaged 19.8 points his senior season. Led the Georgia Bulldogs to the Final Four in 1983. However, they were defeated by NC State, Jim Valvano, and that whole NC State Wolfpack survive and advance. Another great 30 for 30 on ESPN. But the Georgia Bulldogs had a historic run in 1983. In fact, you had the Georgia Lady Bulldogs with Teresa Edwards with a big run as well. Of course, my broadcasting colleague DJ Jones was there on campus. He was a part of it. I know that he's got some amazing stories talking about Teresa Edwards and Vern Fleming and just really everything that was going on at the campus of Georgia. That was the place to be in the early 80s. The 3-time SEC champions. You had Herschel Walker. You had Dominique Wilkins. You had Vern Fleming. Teresa Edwards, it was just incredible. But Vern Fleming, he was a very good point guard for an Indiana Pacers team that was starting to get up and coming. They drafted Reggie Miller. They had Rick Smits. They had players like Mark Jackson. They had Dale Davis, Antonio Davis. I was very impressed with Vern Fleming as a player, a highly underrated player. I want to try to get his accolades. Remember, he was drafted in the 1984 draft along with Sam Bowie, Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon. Briefly mentioned in the movie Air, in his NBA stats, I mean, he had a much better college career, but he was a very good NBA player. He played from the Indiana Pacers from 1984 to 1995, played for the New Jersey Nets. He averaged 11.3 points a game. He was a gold medal Olympian on the 84 Olympics. I wanted to give Vern Fleming some love because he is one of the greatest Georgia basketball players of all time. Now, the next two here didn't really stay that long at the University of Georgia, but their NBA career is one of the reasons why they are on this list. Number 3 is Anthony Edwards. Now, and I know he was at Georgia only for 1 year. In fact, it was the 2019-2020 season. COVID happened, and the season was completely wiped out. The record books is still there, but, they did not crown a champion. Tom Crean could recruit. I know his last season at Georgia, he only had 6 games that he won, but he got Anthony Edwards, a homegrown talent in the state of Georgia, convinced him to come to the University of Georgia. He was the overall number 1 pick in the 2020 draft by the Minnesota Timberwolves. He is an incredible player. Anthony Edwards is going to win championships in the NBA. And he's also a pretty good actor. Saw him in the movie Hustle. See, we got some actors on these lists. You got John Sally for Georgia Tech. You got Anthony Edwards. He played in the movie Hustle and did a great job. I think he probably should have won some awards there. Maybe a Golden Glove, maybe an Oscar. But Anthony Edwards is a great actor, but also a great basketball player for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Right now, he is averaging a little over 20. He's averaging 27.9 points a game, 6 rebounds, 5.3 assists. His field goal percentage is 51%. Anthony Edwards is a superstar in the NBA. And I got him at number 3 because he only played at Georgia for 1 year. All right, moving on the list. Another homegrown player from Georgia out of Greenville. It's Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, the 2-time NBA champion. The town of Greenville honored him in the summertime, displaying a sign that when you enter Greenville, it's the home of the 2-time NBA champion. He won a championship with the Lakers in 2020 in the bubble, recently winning a championship with the Denver Nuggets in 2023. Let me tell you a little bit about Kentavious Caldwell-Pope because he played for the Georgia Bulldogs for 2 seasons, 2011 to 2013. He was the 18th overall pick by the Detroit Pistons. He had a pretty good career with the Detroit Pistons. His career really took off when the Lakers signed him. A great two-way player, a player that can stop you on the defense, and he's got that championship pedigree. And I always like seeing players, especially homegrown players from Georgia. And also, Coach Corey Black of the St. Anne-Pacelli Vikings speaks highly of him as he's known him all his life, playing in his basketball camps. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope at number 4. And finally, rounding out this list of Georgia Bulldogs is probably one of the greatest Georgia Bulldog as far as accolades go. It's Laterrio Green. He's the all-time leading scorer in Georgia history because he did play there 4 years. And he played for the University of Georgia from 1988 to 1992. He was drafted by the Chicago Bulls in the second round in 1992. And obviously, because the Bulls were NBA champions, he did not have an opportunity to play for the Bulls. He went over to the Magic, and where he was a contributor for the Orlando Magic, he did have a career-high 16 points in a game. It's really hard to get playing time when you're backing up players like Scott Skiles and Nick Anderson and Dennis Scott. But Laterrio Green actually had a pretty decent NBA career. He only played 5 seasons in the NBA, but, he was, just a basketball, his IQ and the way he carried himself I love Laterial Green as a player, especially playing for Coach Durham for the University of Georgia. You know, right when Georgia was making that transition, and then all of a sudden Tubby Smith came out of nowhere, and they were a number 3 seed, and then Jim Herrick took over the program. Some players that were honorable mention, Jumaine Jones. You know, he played for the Philadelphia 76ers. You also have Jarvis Hayes, another player. Mark Fox recruited several players like Travis Leslie. It didn't really pan out in the NBA. But I believe that Georgia is up and coming, especially with Mike White in his second year. I think that Georgia is going to at least get to the NIT, and they are going to compete and win some SEC games this upcoming season. Well, that is my list. That is the top 5 the top 5 players from Georgia Tech and the top 5 players from the University of Georgia. Well, that is all the time I have here on this portion of the Sports Beat with Richard Holdridge. I hope you're enjoying your Thursday, and you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will definitely catch you on the flip side.